Chapter 35. La Mazzolata. Gentlemen, said the Count of Monte Cristo as he entered, I pray you, excuse me for suffering my visit to be anticipated, but I feared to disturb you by presenting myself earlier at your apartments. Besides, you sent me word that you would come to me, and I have held myself at your disposal. France and I have to thank you 1,000 times, Count, returned Albert. You extricated us from a great dilemma, and we were on the point of inventing a very fantastic vehicle when your friendly invitation reached us. Truly, returned the Count, motioning the two young men to sit down. It was the fault of that blockhead Pastrini that I did not sooner assist you in your distress. He did not mention a syllable of your embarrassment to me, when he knows that, alone and isolated as I am, I seek every opportunity of making the acquaintance of my neighbors. As soon as I learned I could in any way assist you, I most eagerly seized the opportunity of offering my services. The two young men bowed. France had, as yet, found nothing to say. He had come to no determination, and as nothing in the Count's manner manifested the wish that he should recognize him, he did not know whether to make any allusion to the past, or wait until he had more proof. Besides, although sure it was he who had been in the box the previous evening, he could not be equally positive that this was the man he had seen at the Colosseum. He resolved, therefore, to let things take their course without making any direct overture to the Count. Moreover, he had this advantage: he was master of the Count's secret, while the Count had no hold on France, who had nothing to conceal. However, he resolved to lead the conversation to a subject which may possibly clear up his doubts. Count, said he, you have offered us places in your carriage and at your windows in the Rospoli Palace. Can you tell us where we can obtain a sight of the Piazza del Popolo? Ah, said the Count negligently, looking attentively at Morcerf, is there not something like an execution upon the Piazza del Popolo? Yes, returned France, finding that the Count was coming to the point he wished. Stay, I think I told my steward yesterday to attend to this. Perhaps I can render you this slight service also. He extended his hand and rang the bell thrice. Did you ever occupy yourself, said he to France, with the employment of time and the means of simplifying the summoning your servants? I have. When I ring once, it is for my valet, twice for my majordomo, thrice for my steward. Thus I do not waste a minute or a word. Here he is. A man of about 45 or 50 entered, exactly resembling the smuggler who had introduced France into the cavern, but he did not appear to recognize him. It was evident he had his orders. Monsieur Bertuccio, said the Count, you have procured me windows looking on the Piazza del Popolo, as I ordered you yesterday. Yes, Excellency, returned the steward, but it was very late. Did I not tell you I wished for one? Replied the Count, frowning. And your Excellency has one, which was let to Prince Lobanif, but I was obliged to pay 100. That will do, Monsieur Bertuccio. Spare these gentlemen all such domestic arrangements. You have the window, that is sufficient. Give orders to the coachman, and be in readiness on the stairs to conduct us to it. The steward bowed and was about to quit the room. Ah, continued the Count, be good enough to ask Pastrini if he has received the tavoletta, and if he can send us an account of the execution. There is no need to do that, said France, taking out his tablets, for I saw the account and copied it down. Very well, you can retire, M. Bertuccio, but let us know when breakfast is ready. These gentlemen, added he, turning to the two friends, will, I trust, do me the honor to breakfast with me. But, my dear Count, said Albert, we shall abuse your kindness. Not at all, on the contrary, you will give me great pleasure. You will, one or other of you, perhaps both, return it to me at Paris. M. Bertuccio lay covers for 3. He then took France's tablets out of his hand. We announce, he read, in the same tone with which he would have read a newspaper, that today, the 23d of February will be executed Andrea Rondello, guilty of murder on the person of the respected and venerated Don Cesare Torlini, canon of the Church of St. John, Lateran, and Peppino, called Rocca Priori, convicted of complicity with the detestable bandit Luigi Vampa and the men of his band. The first will be Mazzolato, the second decapitato. Yes, continued the Count, it was at first arranged in this way, but I think since yesterday some change has taken place in the order of the ceremony. Really, said France. Yes, I passed the evening at the Cardinal Rospigliosi's, and there mention was made of something like a pardon for one of the two men. For Andrea Rondello? Asked France. No, replied the Count, carelessly. For the other he glanced at the tablets as if to recall the name. For Peppino, called Rocca Priori. You are thus deprived of seeing a man guillotined, but the Mazzuola still remains, which is a very curious punishment when seen for the first time, and evening the second, while the other, as you must know, is very simple. The mandea asterisk never fails, never trembles, never strikes 30 times ineffectually, like the soldier who beheaded the Count of Chalais, and to whose tender mercy Richelieu had doubtless recommended the sufferer. Ah, added the Count, in a contemptuous tone, do not tell me of European punishments. They are in the infancy, or rather the old age, of cruelty. Asterisk guillotine. Really, Count, replied France, one would think that you had studied the different tortures of all the nations of the world. There are, at least, few that I have not seen, said the Count coldly. And you took pleasure in beholding these dreadful spectacles? My first sentiment was horror, the second indifference, the third curiosity. Curiosity, that is a terrible word. Why so? In life, our greatest preoccupation is death. Is it not, then, curious to study the different ways by which the soul and body can part, and how, according to their different characters, temperaments, and evening, the different customs of their countries, different persons bear the transition from life to death, from existence to annihilation? As for myself, I can assure you of one thing: the more men you see die, the easier it becomes to die yourself, and in my opinion, death may be a torture, but it is not an expiation. I do not quite understand you, replied France. Pray explain your meaning, for you excite my curiosity to the highest pitch. Listen, said the Count, and deep hatred mounted to his face as the blood would to the face of any other. If a man had by unheard of and excruciating tortures destroyed your father, your mother, your betrothed, a being who, when torn from you, left a desolation, a wound that never closes in your breast, do you think the reparation that society gives you is sufficient when it interposes the knife of the guillotine between the base of the occiput and the trapezial muscles of the murderer, and allows him who has caused us years of moral sufferings to escape with a few moments of physical pain? Yes, I know, said France, that human justice is insufficient to console us. She can give blood in return for blood, that is all, but you must demand from her only what it is in her power to grant. I will put another case to you, continued the Count, that where society, attacked by the death of a person, avenges death by death. But are there not 1,000 tortures by which a man may be made to suffer, without society taking the least cognizance of them, or offering him, evening the insufficient means of vengeance of which we have just spoken? Are there not crimes for which the impalement of the Turks, the augurs of the Persians, the stake and the brand of the Iroquois Indians are inadequate tortures, and which are unpunished by society? Answer me, do not these crimes exist? Yes, answered France, and it is to punish them that dueling is tolerated. Ah, dueling, cried the Count, a pleasant manner, upon my soul, of arriving at your end when that end is vengeance. A man has carried off your mistress, a man has seduced your wife, a man has dishonored your daughter, he has rendered the whole life of one who had the right to expect from heaven that portion of happiness God has promised to every one of his creatures, an existence of misery and infamy. and you think you are avenged because you send a ball through the head or pass a sword through the breast of that man who has planted madness in your brain and despair in your heart. And remember, moreover, that it is often he who comes off victorious from the strife, absolved of all crime, in the eyes of the world. No, no, continued the Count, had I to avenge myself, it is not thus I would take revenge. Then you disapprove of dueling? You would not fight a duel? Asked Albert in his turn, astonished at this strange theory. Oh, yes, replied the Count, understand me. I would fight a duel for a trifle, for an insult, for a blow, and the more so that, thanks to my skill in all bodily exercises and the indifference to danger I have gradually acquired, I should be almost certain to kill my man. Oh, I would fight for such a cause, but in return for a slow, profound, eternal torture, I would give back the same, were it possible, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as the Orientalists say, our masters, in everything, those favored creatures who have formed for themselves a life of dreams and a paradise of realities. But, said France to the Count, with this theory, which renders you at once judge and executioner of your own cause, it would be difficult to adopt a course that would forever prevent your falling under the power of the law. Hatred is blind, rage carries you away, and he who pours out vengeance runs the risk of tasting a bitter draught. Yes, if he be poor and inexperienced, not if he be rich and skillful. Besides, the worst that could happen to him would be the punishment, of which we have already spoken, and which the philanthropic French Revolution has substituted for being torn to pieces by horses or broken on the wheel. What matters this punishment as long as he is avenged? On my word, I almost regret that in all probability this miserable Peppino will not be beheaded, as you may have had an opportunity then of seeing how short a time the punishment lasts and whether it is worth evening mentioning. But really this is a most singular conversation for the carnival. Gentlemen, how did it arise? Ah, I recollect, you asked for a place at my window. You shall have it. But let us first sit down to table, for here comes the servant to inform us that breakfast is ready. As he spoke, a servant opened one of the 4 doors of the apartment, saying, Al suo commodo. The 2 young men arose and entered the breakfast room. During the meal, which was excellent and admirably served, France looked repeatedly at Albert in order to observe the impressions which he doubted not had been made on him by the words of their entertainer, but whether with his usual carelessness he had paid but little attention to him, whether the explanation of the Count of Monte Cristo with regard to dueling had satisfied him, or whether the events which France knew of had their effect on him alone. He remarked that his companion did not pay the least regard to them, but on the contrary ate like a man who for the last 4 or 5 months had been condemned to partake of Italian cookery, that is the worst in the world. As for the Count, he just touched the dishes. He seemed to fulfill the duties of a host by sitting down with his guests, and awaited their departure to be served with some strange or more delicate food. This brought back to France, in spite of himself, the recollection of the terror with which the Count had inspired the Countess G, and her firm conviction that the man in the opposite box was a vampire. At the end of the breakfast France took out his watch. Well, said the Count, what are you doing? You must excuse us, Count, returned France, but we have still much to do. What may that be? We have no masks, and it is absolutely necessary to procure them. Do not concern yourself about that. We have, I think, a private room in the Piazza del Popolo. I will have whatever costumes you choose brought to us, and you can dress there. After the execution, cried France. Before or after, whichever you please. Opposite the scaffold. The scaffold forms part of the fate. Count, I have reflected on the matter, said France. I thank you for your courtesy, but I shall content myself with accepting a place in your carriage and at your window at the Rossbally Palace, and I leave you at liberty to dispose of my place at the Piazza del Popolo. But I warn you, you will lose a very curious sight, returned the Count. You will describe it to me, replied Franz, and the recital from your lips will make as great an impression on me as if I had witnessed it. I have more than once intended witnessing an execution, but I have never been able to make up my mind. And you, Albert? I, replied the Viscount. I saw Castaigne executed, but I think I was rather intoxicated that day, for I had quitted college the same morning, and we had passed the previous night at a tavern. Besides, it is no reason because you have not seen an execution at Paris that you should not see one anywhere else when you travel. It is to see everything. Think what a figure you will make when you are asked, "How do they execute at Rome?" And you reply, "I do not know." And besides, they say that the culprit is an infamous scoundrel who killed with a log of wood a worthy canon who had brought him up like his own son. Diable, when a churchman is killed, it should be with a different weapon than a log, especially when he has behaved like a father. If you went to Spain, would you not see the bullfight? Well, suppose it is a bullfight you are going to see. Recollect the ancient Romans of the circus and the sports where they killed 300 lions and 100 men. Think of the 80,000 applauding spectators, the sage matrons who took their daughters, and the charming vestals who made, with the thumb of their white hands, the fatal sign that said, "Come, dispatch the dying." Shall you go, then, Albert? Asked Franz. Ma foi, yes, like you. I hesitated, but the Count's eloquence decides me. Let us go, then, said Franz, since you wish it. But on our way to the Piazza del Popolo, I wish to pass through the Corso. Is this possible, Count? On foot? Yes. In a carriage? No. I will go on foot. Then, is it important that you should go that way? Yes, there is something I wish to see. Well, we will go by the Corso. We will send the carriage to wait for us on the Piazza del Popolo by the Strada del Babuino, for I shall be glad to pass myself through the Corso to see if some orders I have given have been executed. Excellency, said a servant, opening the door, a man in the dress of a penitent wishes to speak to you. Ah, yes, returned the Count, I know who he is. Gentlemen, will you return to the salon? You will find good cigars on the center table. I will be with you directly. The young men rose and returned into the salon, while the Count, again apologizing, left by another door. Albert, who was a great smoker, and who had considered it no small sacrifice to be deprived of the cigars of the Café de Paris, approached the table and uttered a cry of joy at perceiving some veritable puros. Well, asked Franz, what think you of the Count of Monte Cristo? What do I think? Said Albert, evidently surprised at such a question from his companion. I think he is a delightful fellow, who does the honors of his table admirably, who has traveled much, read much, is like Brutus of the Stoic school, and moreover, added he, sending a volume of smoke up towards the ceiling, that he has excellent cigars. Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz well knew that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon long reflection, he made no attempt to change it. But, said he, did you observe one very singular thing? What? How attentively he looked at you. At me? Yes. Albert reflected. Ah, replied he, sighing, that is not very surprising. I have been more than a year absent from Paris, and my clothes are of a most antiquated cut. The Count takes me for a provincial. The first opportunity you have, undeceive him, I beg, and tell him I am nothing of the kind. Franz smiled. An instant after the Count entered. I am now quite at your service, gentlemen, said he. The carriage is going one way to the Piazza del Popolo, and we will go another, and, if you please, by the Corso. Take some more of these cigars, M. de Morcerf. With all my heart, returned Albert. Italian cigars are horrible. When you come to Paris, I will return all this. I will not refuse. I intend going there soon, and since you allow me, I will pay you a visit. Come, we have not any time to lose. It is 12:30. Let us set off. All three descended. The coachman received his master's orders and drove down the Via del Babuino, while the three gentlemen walked along the Piazza de Spagni and the Via Fratina, which led directly between the Fiano and Rospoli palaces. France's attention was directed towards the windows of that last palace, for he had not forgotten the signal agreed upon between the man in the mantle and the Transstever peasant. "Which are your windows?" asked he of the count, with as much indifference as he could assume. "The three last," returned he, with a negligence evidently unaffected, for he could not imagine with what intention the question was put. France glanced rapidly towards the three windows. The side windows were hung with yellow damask, and the center one with white damask and a red cross. The man in the mantle had kept his promise to the Transsteverin, and there could now be no doubt that he was the count. The three windows were still untenanted. Preparations were making on every side. Chairs were placed, scaffolds were raised, and windows were hung with flags. The masks could not appear, the carriages could not move about, but the masks were visible behind the windows, the carriages, and the doors. France, Albert, and the Count continued to descend the Corso. As they approached the Piazza del Popolo, the crowd became more dense, and above the heads of the multitude two objects were visible: the obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square, and in front of the obelisk, at the point where the three streets, del Babuino, del Corso, and di Ripetta, meet, the two uprights of the scaffold, between which glittered the curved knife of the mandea. At the corner of the street they met the Count's steward, who was awaiting his master. The window, let at an exorbitant price, which the Count had doubtless wished to conceal from his guests, was on the second floor of the great palace, situated between the Via del Babuino and the Monte Pincio. It consisted, as we have said, of a small dressing room opening into a bedroom, and when the door of communication was shut, the inmates were quite alone. On chairs were laid elegant masquerade costumes of blue and white satin. "As you left the choice of your costumes to me," said the Count to the two friends, "I have had these brought, as they will be the most worn this year, and they are most suitable on account of the confetti sweetmeats, as they do not show the flower." France heard the words of the Count but imperfectly, and he perhaps did not fully appreciate this new attention to their wishes, for he was wholly absorbed by the spectacle that the Piazza del Popolo presented, and by the terrible instrument that was in the center. It was the first time France had ever seen a guillotine. We say guillotine because the Roman mandea is formed on almost the same model as the French instrument. Asterisk the knife, which is shaped like a crescent, that cuts with the convex side, falls from a less height, and that is all the difference. Two men, seated on the movable plank on which the victim is laid, were eating their breakfasts while waiting for the criminal. Their repast consisted apparently of bread and sausages. One of them lifted the plank, took out a flask of wine, drank some, and then passed it to his companion. These two men were the executioner's assistants. At this sight France felt the perspiration start forth upon his brow. The prisoners, transported the previous evening from the Carcere Nuovo to the little church of Santa Maria del Popolo, had passed the night, each accompanied by two priests, in a chapel closed by a grating, before which were two sentinels, who were relieved at intervals. A double line of carbineers, placed on each side of the door of the church, reached to the scaffold and formed a circle around it, leaving a path about 10 feet wide, and around the guillotine a space of nearly 100 feet. All the rest of the square was paved with heads. Many women held their infants on their shoulders, and thus the children had the best view. The Monte Pinzo seemed a vast amphitheater filled with spectators. The balconies of the two churches at the corner of the Via del Babuino and the Via di Ripetta were crammed. The steps evening seemed a party-colored sea that was impelled towards the portico. Every niche in the wall held its living statue. What the Count said was true. The most curious spectacle in life is that of death. And yet, instead of the silence and the solemnity demanded by the occasion, laughter and jests arose from the crowd. It was evident that the execution was, in the eyes of the people, only the commencement of the carnival. Suddenly the tumult ceased as if by magic, and the doors of the church opened. They, brotherhood of penitents, clothed from head to foot in robes of grey sackcloth, with holes for the eyes, and holding in their hands lighted tapers, appeared first. The chief marched at the head. Behind the penitents came a man of vast stature and proportions. He was naked, with the exception of cloth drawers at the left side of which hung a large knife in a sheath, and he bore on his right shoulder a heavy iron sledge-hammer. This man was the executioner. He had, moreover, sandals bound on his feet by cords. Behind the executioner came, in the order in which they were to die, first Peppino and then Andrea. Each was accompanied by 2 priests. Neither had his eyes bandaged. Peppino walked with a firm step, doubtless aware of what awaited him. Andrea was supported by 2 priests. Each of them, from time to time, kissed the crucifix a confessor held out to them. At this sight alone France felt his legs tremble under him. He looked at Albert. He was as white as his shirt, and mechanically cast away his cigar, although he had not half smoked it. The Count alone seemed unmoved. No, more, a slight color seemed striving to rise in his pale cheeks. His nostrils dilated like those of a wild beast that scents its prey, and his lips half opened disclosed his white teeth, small and sharp like those of a jackal. And yet his features wore an expression of smiling tenderness, such as France had never before witnessed in them. His black eyes especially were full of kindness and pity. However, the 2 culprits advanced, and as they approached, their faces became visible. Peppino was a handsome young man of 4 or 25, bronzed by the sun. He carried his head erect and seemed on the watch to see on which side his liberator would appear. Andrea was short and fat. His visage, marked with brutal cruelty, did not indicate age. He may be 30. In prison he had suffered his beard to grow. His head fell on his shoulder. His legs bent beneath him, and his movements were apparently automatic and unconscious. Doctor Guillotin got the idea of his famous machine from witnessing an execution in Italy. I thought, said France to the Count, that you told me there would be but one execution. I told you true, replied he coldly, and yet here are 2 culprits. Yes, but only one of these 2 is about to die. The other has many years to live. If the pardon is to come, there is no time to lose. And see, here it is, said the Count. At the moment when Peppino reached the foot of the mandea, a priest arrived in some haste, forced his way through the soldiers, and advancing to the chief of the Brotherhood, gave him a folded paper. The piercing eye of Peppino had noticed all. The chief took the paper, unfolded it, and raising his hand, Heaven be praised, and His Holiness also, said he in a loud voice, here is a pardon for one of the prisoners. A pardon, cried the people with one voice, a pardon. At this cry, Andrea raised his head. Pardon for whom? Cried he. Peppino remained breathless. A pardon for Peppino, called Rocca. Priori, said the principal friar, and he passed the paper to the officer commanding the carbineers, who read and returned it to him. For Peppino, cried Andrea, who seemed roused from the torpor in which he had been plunged. Why for him and not for me? We ought to die together. I was promised he should die with me. You have no right to put me to death alone. I will not die alone. I will not. And he broke from the priests, struggling and raving like a wild beast, and striving desperately to break the cords that bound his hands. The executioner made a sign, and his 2 assistants leaped from the scaffold and seized him. What is going on? Asked France of the Count, for, as all the talk was in the Roman dialect, he had not perfectly understood it. Do you not see, returned the Count, that this human creature who is about to die is furious that his fellow sufferer does not perish with him, and, were he able, he would rather tear him to pieces with his tests and nails than let him enjoy the life he himself is about to be deprived of. Oh, man, race of crocodiles, cried the Count, extending his clenched hands towards the crowd. How well do I recognize you there, and that at all times you are worthy of yourselves. Meanwhile Andrea and the two executioners were struggling on the ground, and he kept exclaiming, "He ought to die, he shall die, I will not die alone." Look, cried the Count, seizing the young men's hands, look, for, on my soul it is curious. Here is a man who had resigned himself to his fate, who was going to the scaffold to die, like a coward, it is true, but he was about to die without resistance. Do you know what gave him strength? Do you know what consoled him? It was that another partook of his punishment, that another partook of his anguish, that another was to die before him. Lead 2 sheep to the butcher's, 2 oxen to the slaughterhouse, and make one of them understand that his companion will not die. The sheep will bleat for pleasure, the ox will bellow with joy. But man, whom God created in his own image, man, upon whom God has laid his sole commandment, to love his neighbor, man, to whom God has given a voice to express his thoughts, what is his first cry when he hears his fellow man is saved? A blasphemy. Honor to man, this masterpiece of nature, this king of the creation. And the Count burst into a laugh, a terrible laugh, that showed he must have suffered horribly to be able thus to laugh. However, the struggle still continued, and it was dreadful to witness. The people all took part against Andrea, and 20,000 voices cried, "Put him to death! Put him to death!" France sprang back, but the Count seized his arm and held him before the window. "What are you doing?" said he. "Do you pity him? If you heard the cry of mad dog, you would take your gun, you would, unhesitatingly shoot the poor beast, who, after all, was only guilty of having been bitten by another dog. And yet you pity a man who, without being bitten by one of his race, has yet murdered his benefactor, and who, now unable to kill any one because his hands are bound, wishes to see his companion in captivity perish. No, look, the command was needless. France was fascinated by the horrible spectacle. The 2 assistants had borne Andrea to the scaffold, and there, in spite of his struggles, his bites, and his cries, had forced him to his knees. During this time the executioner had raised his mace, and signed to them to get out of the way. The criminals strove to rise, but before he had time, the mace fell on his left temple. A dull and heavy sound was heard, and the man dropped like an ox on his face, and then turned over on his back. The executioner let fall his mace, drew his knife, and with one stroke opened his throat, and mounting on his stomach, stamped violently on it with his feet. At every stroke a jet of blood sprang from the wound. This time France could contain himself no longer, but sank, half fainting, into a seat. Albert, with his eyes closed, was standing, grasping the window curtains. Chapter 36. The Carnival at Rome. When France recovered his senses, he saw Albert drinking a glass of water, of which, to judge from his pallor, he stood in great need, and the Count, who was assuming his masquerade costume. He glanced mechanically towards the square. The scene was wholly changed. Scaffold, executioners, victims, all had disappeared. Only the people remained, full of noise and excitement. The bell of Monte, which only sounds on the Pope's decease and the opening of the carnival, was ringing a joyous peal. "Well," asked he of the Count, "what has, then, happened?" "Nothing," replied the Count, "only, as you see, the carnival has commenced. Make haste and dress yourself." In fact, said France, this horrible scene has passed away like a dream. It is but a dream, a nightmare, that has disturbed you. Yes, that I have suffered, but the culprit? That is a dream also, only he has remained asleep, while you have awakened, and who knows which of you is the most fortunate? But Peppino, what has become of him? Peppino is a lad of sense who, unlike most men who are happy in proportion as they are noticed, was delighted to see that the general attention was directed towards his companion. He profited by this distraction to slip away among the crowd without even thanking the worthy priests who accompanied him. Decidedly, man is an ungrateful and egotistical animal, but dress yourself. See, M. de Morcerf sets you the example. Albert was drawing on the satin pantaloon over his black trousers and varnished boots. Well, Albert, said France, do you feel much inclined to join the revels? Come, answer frankly. Ma foi, no, returned Albert, but I am really glad to have seen such a sight, and I understand what the Count said, that when you have once habituated yourself to a similar spectacle, it is the only one that causes you any emotion, without reflecting that this is the only moment in which you can study character, said the Count. On the steps of the scaffold death tears off the mask that has been worn through life, and the real visage is disclosed. It must be allowed that Andrea was not very handsome. The hideous scoundrel! Come, dress yourselves, gentlemen, dress yourselves. France felt it would be ridiculous not to follow his two companions' example. He assumed his costume and fastened on the mask that scarcely equaled the pallor of his own face. Their toilet finished, they descended. The carriage awaited them at the door, filled with sweetmeats and bouquets. They fell into the line of carriages. It is difficult to form an idea of the perfect change that had taken place. Instead of the spectacle of gloomy and silent death, the Piazza del Popolo presented a spectacle of gay and noisy mirth and revelry. A crowd of masks flowed in from all sides, emerging from the doors, descending from the windows. From every street and every corner drove carriages filled with clowns, harlequins, dominoes, mummers, pantomimists, transteverins, knights, and peasants, screaming, fighting, gesticulating, throwing eggs filled with flour, confetti, nosegays, attacking, with their sarcasms and their missiles, friends and foes, companions and strangers, indiscriminately, and no one took offense or did anything but laugh. France and Albert were like men who, to drive away a violent sorrow, have recourse to wine, and who, as they drink and become intoxicated, feel a thick veil drawn between the past and the present. They saw, or rather continued to see, the image of what they had witnessed, but little by little the general vertigo seized them, and they felt themselves obliged to take part in the noise and confusion. A handful of confetti that came from a neighboring carriage, and which, while it covered Morcerf and his two companions with dust, pricked his neck and that portion of his face, uncovered by his mask like 100 pins, incited him to join in the general combat in which all the masks around him were engaged. He rose, in his turn, and seizing handfuls of confetti and sweetmeats, with which the carriage was filled, cast them with all the force and skill he was master of. The strife had fairly begun, and the recollection of what they had seen half an hour before was gradually effaced from the young men's minds, so much were they occupied by the gay and glittering procession they now beheld. As for the Count of Monte Cristo, he had never for an instant shown any appearance of having been moved. Imagine the large and splendid Corso, bordered from one end to the other with lofty palaces, with their balconies hung with carpets, and their windows with flags. These balconies are 300,000 spectators, Romans, Italians, strangers from all parts of the world, the united aristocracy of birth, wealth, and genius. Lovely women, yielding to the influence of the scene, bend over their balconies or lean from their windows and shower down confetti, which are returned by bouquets. The air seems darkened, with the falling confetti and flying flowers. In the streets, the lively crowd is dressed in the most fantastic costumes. Gigantic cabbages walk gravely about, buffaloes' heads bellow from men's shoulders, dogs walk on their hind legs. In the mid of all this a mask is lifted, and as in Callot's Temptation of St. Anthony, a lovely face is exhibited, which we would fain follow, but from which we are separated by troops of fiends. This will give a faint idea of the carnival at Rome. At the second turn, the Count stopped the carriage and requested permission to withdraw, leaving the vehicle at their disposal. France looked up. They were opposite the Rospoli Palace. At the center window, the one hung with white damask with a red cross, was a blue domino beneath, which France's imagination easily pictured the beautiful Greek of the Argentina. Gentlemen, said the Count, springing out, when you are tired of being actors and wish to become spectators of this scene, you know you have places at my windows. In the meantime, dispose of my coachman, my carriage, and my servants. We have forgotten to mention that the Count's coachman was attired in a bear skin, exactly resembling Audrey's in The Bear and the Pasha, and the two footmen behind were dressed up as green monkeys with spring masks with which they made grimaces at every one who passed. France thanked the Count for his attention. As for Albert, he was busily occupied throwing bouquets at a carriage full of Roman peasants that was passing near him. Unfortunately for him, the line of carriages moved on again, and while he descended the Piazza del Popolo, the other ascended towards the Palazzo di Venezia. Ah, my dear fellow, said he to France, you did not see, what? There, that calash filled with Roman peasants. No. Well, I am convinced they are all charming women. How unfortunate that you were masked, Albert, said France. Here was an opportunity of making up for past disappointments. Oh, replied he, half laughing, half serious, I hope the carnival will not pass without some amends in one shape or the other. But, in spite of Albert's hope, the day passed unmarked by any incident, excepting 2 or 3 encounters with the carriage full of Roman peasants. At one of these encounters, accidentally or purposely, Albert's mask fell off. He instantly rose and cast the remainder of the bouquets into the carriage. Doubtless one of the charming females Albert had detected beneath their coquettish disguise was touched by his gallantry, for, as the carriage of the two friends passed her, she threw a bunch of violets. Albert seized it, and as France had no reason to suppose it was meant for him, he suffered Albert to retain it. Albert placed it in his buttonhole, and the carriage went triumphantly on. Well, said France to him, there is the beginning of an adventure. Laugh if you please, I really think so. So I will not abandon this bouquet. Pardon you, returned France, laughing, in token of your ingratitude. The jest, however, soon appeared to become earnest, for when Albert and France again encountered the carriage with the contadini, the one who had thrown the violets to Albert clapped her hands when she beheld them in his buttonhole. Bravo, bravo, said France, things go wonderfully. Shall I leave you? Perhaps you would prefer being alone? No, replied he, I will not be caught like a fool at a first disclosure by a rendezvous under the clock, as they say at the opera balls. If the fair peasant wishes to carry matters any further, we shall find her, or rather, she will find us tomorrow. Then she will give me some sign or other, and I shall know what I have to do. On my word, said France, you are wise as Nestor and prudent as Ulysses, and your fair Circe must be very skillful or very powerful if she succeed in changing you into a beast of any kind. Albert was right. The fair unknown had resolved, doubtless, to carry the intrigue no farther, for although the young men made several more turns, they did not again see the calash, which had turned up one of the neighboring streets. Then they returned to the Rospoli Palace, but the Count and the blue domino had also disappeared. The 2 windows, hung with yellow damask, were still occupied by the persons whom the Count had invited. At this moment the same bell that had proclaimed the beginning of the Mascherata sounded the retreat. The file on the Corso broke the line, and in a second all the carriages had disappeared. France and Albert were opposite the Via del Marat. The coachman, without saying a word, drove up it, passed along the Piazza di Spagni and the Rospoli Palace, and stopped at the door of the hotel. Signor Pastrini came to the door to receive his guests. France hastened to inquire after the Count and to express regret that he had not returned in sufficient time, but Pastrini reassured him by saying that the Count of Monte Cristo had ordered a second carriage for himself, and that it had gone at 4 o'clock to fetch him from the Rospoli Palace. The Count had, moreover, charged him to offer the two friends the key of his box at the Argentina. France questioned Albert as to his intentions, but Albert had great projects to put into execution before going to the theatre, and instead of making any answer, he inquired if Signor Pastrini could procure him a tailor. A tailor, said the host, and for what? To make us between now and to tomorrow 2 Roman peasant costumes, returned Albert. The host shook his head. To make you 2 costumes, between now and to tomorrow, I ask your excellency's pardon, but this is quite a French demand. For the next week you will not find a single tailor who would consent to sew 6 buttons on a waistcoat if you paid him a crown apiece for each button. Then I must give up the idea. No, we have them ready-made. Leave all to me, and to tomorrow, when you awake, you shall find a collection of costumes with which you will be satisfied. My dear Albert, said France, leave all to our host. He has already proved himself full of resources. Let us dine quietly, and afterwards go and see the Algerian captive. Agreed, returned Albert. But remember, Signor Pastrini, that both my friend and myself attach the greatest importance to having to tomorrow the costumes we have asked for. The host again assured them they may rely on him, and that their wishes should be attended to, upon which France and Albert mounted to their apartments and proceeded to disencumber themselves of their costumes. Albert, as he took off his dress, carefully preserved the bunch of violets. It was his token reserved for the tomorrow. The 2 friends sat down to table, but they could not refrain from remarking the difference between the Count of Monte Cristo's table and that of Signor Pastrini. Truth compelled France, in spite of the dislike he seemed to have taken to the Count, to confess that the advantage was not on Pastrini's side. During dessert, the servant inquired at what time they wished for the carriage. Albert and France looked at each other, fearing really to abuse the Count's kindness. The servant understood them. His Excellency the Count of Monte Cristo had, he said, given positive orders that the carriage was to remain at their lordships' orders all day, and they could therefore dispose of it without fear of indiscretion. They resolved to profit by the Count's courtesy, and ordered the horses to be harnessed, while they substituted evening dress for that which they had on, and which was somewhat the worse for the numerous combats they had sustained. This precaution taken, they went to the theatre and installed themselves in the Count's box. During the first act, the Countess G entered. Her first look was at the box, where she had seen the Count the previous evening, so that she perceived France and Albert in the place of the very person concerning whom she had expressed so strange an opinion to France. Her opera glass was so fixedly directed towards them that France saw it would be cruel not to satisfy her curiosity, and, availing himself of one of the privileges of the spectators of the Italian theaters, who use their boxes to hold receptions, the 2 friends went to pay their respects to the Countess. Scarcely had they entered, when she motioned to France to assume the seat of honor. Albert, in his turn, sat behind. Well, said she, hardly giving France time to sit down, it seems you have nothing better to do than to make the acquaintance of this new lord, Ruthven, and you are already the best friends in the world. Without being so far advanced as that, my dear Countess, returned France, I cannot deny that we have abused his good nature all day. All day? Yes, this morning we breakfasted with him. We rode in his carriage all day, and now we have taken possession of his box. You know him, then? Yes and no. How so? It is a long story. Tell it to me. It would frighten you too much. So much the more reason. At least wait until the story has a conclusion. Very well, I prefer complete histories. But tell me how you made his acquaintance. Did anyone introduce you to him? No, it was he who introduced himself to us. Last night, after we left you. Through what medium? The very prosaic one of our landlord. He is staying, then, at the Hotel de Londres with you? Not only in the same hotel, but on the same floor. What is his name? For, of course, you know, the Count of Monte Cristo. That is not a family name? No, it is the name of the island he has purchased. And he is a count, a Tuscan count. Well, we must put up with that, said the countess, who was herself from one of the oldest Venetian families. What sort of a man is he? Ask the Vicomte de Morcerf. You hear, M. de Morcerf, I am referred to you, said the countess. We should be very hard to please, madam, returned Albert. Did we not think him delightful? A friend of 10 years' standing could not have done more for us, or with a more perfect courtesy. Come, observed the countess, smiling, I see my vampire is only some millionaire who has taken the appearance of Lara in order to avoid being confounded with M. de Rothschild, and you have seen her, the beautiful Greek of yesterday. No, we heard, I think, the sound of her guzla, but she remained perfectly invisible. When you say invisible, interrupted Albert, it is only to keep up the mystery. For whom do you take the blue domino at the window with the white curtains? Where was this window with white hangings? Asked the countess. At the Rospoli Palace. The count had 3 windows at the Rospoli Palace. Yes. Did you pass through the Corso? Yes. Well, did you notice 2 windows hung with yellow damask, and one with white damask with a red cross? Those were the count's windows. Why, he must be a nabob. Do you know what those 3 windows were worth? 200 or 300 Roman crowns? 2 or 3,000. The deuce! Does his island produce him such a revenue? It does not bring him a baiocco. Then why did he purchase it? For a whim. He is an original, then? In reality, observed Albert, he seemed to me somewhat eccentric. Were he at Paris and a frequenter of the theaters, I should say he was a poor devil, literally mad. This morning he made 2 or 3 exits worthy of Didier or Anthony. At this moment a fresh visitor entered, and, according to custom, France gave up his seat to him. This circumstance had, moreover, the effect of changing the conversation. An hour afterwards the 2 friends returned to their hotel. Signor Pastrini had already set about procuring their disguises for the tomorrow, and he assured them that they would be perfectly satisfied. The next morning, at 9 o'clock, he entered France's room, followed by a tailor, who had 8 or 10 Roman peasant costumes on his arm. They selected 2, exactly alike, and charged the tailor to sew on each of their hats about 20 yards of ribbon, and to procure them 2 of the long silk sashes, of different colors, with which the lower orders decorate themselves on fête days. Albert was impatient to see how he looked in his new dress, a jacket and breeches of blue velvet, silk stockings with clocks, shoes with buckles, and a silk waistcoat. This picturesque attire set him off to great advantage, and when he had bound the scarf around his waist, and when his hat, placed coquettishly on one side, let fall on his shoulder a stream of ribbons, France was forced to confess that costume has much to do with the physical superiority we accord to certain nations. The Turks used to be so picturesque with their long and flowing robes, but are they not now hideous with their blue frocks buttoned up to the chin, and their red caps, which make them look like a bottle of wine with a red seal? France complimented Albert, who looked at himself in the glass with an unequivocal smile of satisfaction. They were thus engaged when the Count of Monte Cristo entered. "Gentlemen," said he, "although a companion is agreeable, perfect freedom is sometimes still more agreeable. I come to say that today and for the remainder of the carnival, I leave the carriage entirely at your disposal. The host will tell you I have 3 or 4 more, so that you will not inconvenience me in any way. Make use of it, I pray you, for your pleasure or your business." The young men wished to decline, but they could find no good reason for refusing an offer which was so agreeable to them. The Count of Monte Cristo remained a quarter of an hour with them, conversing on all subjects with the greatest ease. He was, as we have already said, perfectly well acquainted with the literature of all countries. A glance at the walls of his salon proved to France and Albert that he was a connoisseur of pictures. A few words he let fall showed them that he was no stranger to the sciences, and he seemed much occupied with chemistry. The two friends did not venture to return the Count the breakfast he had given them. It would have been too absurd to offer him in exchange for his excellent table the very inferior one of Signor Pastrini. They told him so frankly, and he received their excuses with the air of a man who appreciated their delicacy. Albert was charmed with the Count's manners, and he was only prevented from recognizing him for a perfect gentleman by reason of his varied knowledge. The permission to do what he liked with the carriage pleased him above all, for the fair peasants had appeared in a most elegant carriage the preceding evening, and Albert was not sorry to be upon an equal footing with them. At 1:30 they descended. The coachman and footman had put on their livery over their disguises, which gave them a more ridiculous appearance than ever, and which gained them the applause of France and Albert. Albert had fastened the faded bunch of violets to his buttonhole. At the first sound of the bell they hastened into the Corso by the Via Vittoria. At the second turn, a bunch of fresh violets, thrown from a carriage filled with harlequins, indicated to Albert that, like himself and his friend, the peasants had changed their costume also, and whether it was the result of chance, or whether a similar feeling had possessed them both, while he had changed his costume they had assumed his. Albert placed the fresh bouquet in his buttonhole, but he kept the faded one in his hand, and when he again met the calash, he raised it to his lips, an action which seemed greatly to amuse not only the fair lady who had thrown it, but her joyous companions also. The day was as gay as the preceding one, perhaps evening more animated and noisy. The Count appeared for an instant at his window, but when they again passed he had disappeared. It is almost needless to say that the flirtation between Albert and the fair peasant continued all day. In the evening, on his return, France found a letter from the embassy informing him that he would have the honor of being received by His Holiness the next day. At each previous visit he had made to Rome, he had solicited and obtained the same favor, and incited as much by a religious feeling as by gratitude. He was unwilling to quit the capital of the Christian world without laying his respectful homage at the feet of one of St. Peter's successors who has set the rare example of all the virtues. He did not then think of the carnival, for in spite of his condescension and touching kindness, one cannot incline one's self without awe before the venerable and noble old man called Gregory Roman 16. On his return from the Vatican, France carefully avoided the Corso. He brought away with him a treasure of pious thoughts, to which the mad gaiety of the maskers would have been profanation. At 5 Albert entered, overjoyed. The harlequin had reassumed her peasant's costume, and as she passed she raised her mask. She was charming. France congratulated Albert, who received his congratulations with the air of a man conscious that they are merited. He had recognized by certain unmistakable signs that his fair incognita belonged to the aristocracy. He had made up his mind to write to her the next day. France remarked, while he gave these details, that Albert seemed to have something to ask of him, but that he was unwilling to ask it. He insisted upon it, declaring beforehand that he was willing to make any sacrifice the other wished. Albert let himself be pressed just as long as friendship required, and then avowed to France that he would do him a great favor by allowing him to occupy the carriage alone the next day. Albert attributed to France's absence the extreme kindness of the fair peasant in raising her mask. France was not sufficiently egotistical to stop Albert in the middle of an adventure that promised to prove so agreeable to his curiosity and so flattering to his vanity. He felt assured that the perfect indiscretion of his friend would duly inform him of all that happened, and as, during 3 years that he had traveled all over Italy, a similar piece of good fortune had never fallen to his share, France was by no means sorry to learn how to act on such an occasion. He therefore promised Albert that he would content himself the tomorrow with witnessing the carnival from the windows of the Rospoli Palace. The next morning he saw Albert pass and repass holding an enormous bouquet, which he doubtless meant to make the bearer of his amorous epistle. This belief was changed into certainty when France saw the bouquet conspicuous by a circle of white camellias in the hand of a charming harlequin dressed in rose-colored satin. The evening was no longer joy, but delirium. Albert nothing doubted but that the fair unknown would reply in the same manner. France anticipated his wishes by saying that the noise fatigued him and that he should pass the next day in writing and looking over his journal. Albert was not deceived, for the next evening France saw him enter triumphantly shaking a folded paper, which he held by one corner. "Well," said he, "was I mistaken?" "She has answered you," cried France. "Read." This word was pronounced in a manner impossible to describe. France took the letter and read. Tuesday evening, at 7 o'clock, descend from your carriage opposite the Via dei Pontifici, and follow the Roman peasant who snatches your torch from you. When you arrive at the first step of the church of San Giacomo, be sure to fasten a knot of rose-colored ribbons to the shoulder of your harlequin costume, in order that you may be recognized. Until then you will not see me. Constancy and discretion. "Well," asked he, when France had finished, "what do you think of that?" "I think that the adventure is assuming a very agreeable appearance." "I think so, also," replied Albert, "and I very much fear you will go alone to the Duke of Bracciano's ball." France and Albert had received that morning an invitation from the celebrated Roman banker. "Take care, Albert," said France. "All the nobility of Rome will be present, and if your fair incognita belong to the higher class of society, she must go there." "Whether she goes there or not, my opinion is still the same," returned Albert. "You have read the letter?" "Yes." "You know how imperfectly the women of the Mezzoceto are educated in Italy. This is the name of the lower class." "Yes." "Well, read the letter again. Look at the writing, and find, if you can, any blemish in the language or orthography." The writing was, in reality, charming, and the orthography irreproachable. "You are born to good fortune," said France as he returned the letter. "Laugh as much as you will," replied Albert. "I am in love." "You alarm me," cried France. "I see that I shall not only go alone to the Duke of Bracciano's, but also return to Florence alone. If my unknown be as amiable as she is beautiful," said Albert, "I shall fix myself at Rome for 6 weeks at least. I adore Rome, and I have always had a great taste for archaeology. Come, 2 or 3 more such adventures, and I do not despair of seeing you a member of the Academy." Doubtless Albert was about to discuss seriously his right to the academic chair when they were informed that dinner was ready. Albert's love had not taken away his appetite. He hastened with France to seat himself, free to recommence the discussion. After dinner, the Count of Monte Cristo was announced. They had not seen him for 2 days. Signor Pastrini informed them that business had called him to Civitavecchia. He had started the previous evening, and had only returned an hour since. He was charming. Whether he kept a watch over himself, or whether by accident he did not sound the acrimonious chords that in other circumstances had been touched, he was tonight like everybody else. The man was an enigma to France. The Count must feel sure that France recognized him, and yet he had not let fall a single word indicating any previous acquaintance between them. On his side, however great France's desire was to allude to their former interview, the fear of being disagreeable to the man who had loaded him and his friend with kindness prevented him from mentioning it. The Count had learned that the two friends had sent to secure a box at the Argentina Theatre and were told they were all let. In consequence, he brought them the key of his own. At least such was the apparent motive of his visit. France and Albert made some difficulty, alleging their fear of depriving him of it, but the Count replied that, as he was going to the Palais Theatre, the box at the Argentina Theatre would be lost if they did not profit by it. This assurance determined the two friends to accept it. France had by degrees become accustomed to the Count's pallor, which had so forcibly struck him at their first meeting. He could not refrain from admiring the severe beauty of his features, the only defect, or rather, the principal quality of which was the pallor. Truly, a Byronic hero. France could not, we will not say see him, but evening think of him without imagining his stern head upon Manfred's shoulders or beneath Lara's helmet. His forehead was marked with the line that indicates the constant presence of bitter thoughts. He had the fiery eyes that seem to penetrate to the very soul, and the haughty and disdainful upper lip that gives to the words it utters a peculiar character that impresses them on the minds of those to whom they are addressed. The Count was no longer young. He was at least 40, and yet it was easy to understand that he was formed to rule the young men with whom he associated at present, and to complete his resemblance with the fantastic heroes of the English poet. The Count seemed to have the power of fascination. Albert was constantly expatiating on their good fortune in meeting such a man. France was less enthusiastic, but the Count exercised over him also the ascendancy a strong mind always acquires over a mind less domineering. He thought several times of the project the Count had of visiting Paris, and he had no doubt but that, with his eccentric character, his characteristic face, and his colossal fortune, he would produce a great effect there. And yet he did not wish to be at Paris when the Count was there. The evening passed as evenings mostly pass at Italian theaters, that is, not in listening to the music, but in paying visits and conversing. The Countess G. wished to revive the subject of the Count, but France announced he had something far newer to tell her, and, in spite of Albert's demonstrations of false modesty, he informed the Countess of the great event which had preoccupied them for the last 3 days. As similar intrigues are not uncommon in Italy, if we may credit travelers, the Comtesse did not manifest the least incredulity, but congratulated Albert on his success. They promised, upon separating, to meet at the Duke of Bracciano's ball, to which all Rome was invited. The heroine of the bouquet kept her word. She gave Albert no sign of her existence the tomorrow or the day after. At length Tuesday came, the last and most tumultuous day of the carnival. On Tuesday, the theaters open at 10 o'clock in the morning, as Lent begins after 8 at night. On Tuesday, all those who through want of money, time, or enthusiasm have not been to see the carnival before mingle in the gaiety and contribute to the noise and excitement. From 2 o'clock till 5 France and Albert followed in the fete, exchanging handfuls of confetti with the other carriages and the pedestrians who crowded amongst the horses' feet and the carriage wheels without a single accident, a single dispute, or a single fight. The fetes are veritable pleasure days to the Italians. The author of this history, who has resided 5 or 6 years in Italy, does not recollect to have ever seen a ceremony interrupted by one of those events so common in other countries. Albert was triumphant in his harlequin costume. A knot of rose-colored ribbons fell from his shoulder, almost to the ground. In order that there may be no confusion, France wore his peasant's costume. As the day advanced, the tumult became greater. There was not on the pavement, in the carriages, at the windows, a single tongue that was silent, a single arm that did not move. It was a human storm, made up of a thunder of cries and a hail of sweetmeats, flowers, eggs, oranges, and nosegays. At 3 o'clock the sound of fireworks let off on the Piazza del Popolo, and the Piazza di Venezia heard with difficulty amid the din and confusion announced that the races were about to begin. The races, like the Macaulay, are one of the episodes peculiar to the last days of the carnival. At the sound of the fireworks the carriages instantly broke ranks and retired by the adjacent streets. All these evolutions are executed with an inconceivable address and marvelous rapidity, without the police interfering in the matter. The pedestrians ranged themselves against the walls, then the trampling of horses and the clashing of steel were heard. A detachment of carbineers, 15 abreast, galloped up the Corso in order to clear it for the Barbary. When the detachment arrived at the Piazza di Venezia, a second volley of fireworks was discharged to announce that the street was clear. Almost instantly, in the amid of a tremendous and general outcry, 7 or 8 horses, excited by the shouts of 300,000 spectators, passed by like lightning. Then the castle of Saint Angelo fired 3 cannon to indicate that number 3 had won. Immediately, without any other signal, the carriages moved on, flowing on towards the Corso, down all the streets, like torrents pent up for a while, which again flow into the parent river, and the immense stream again continued its course between its 2 granite banks. A new source of noise and movement was added to the crowd. The sellers of Macolti entered on the scene. The Macaulay or Macolti are candles which vary in size from the Paschal taper to the rushlight, and which give to each actor in the great final scene of the carnival 2 very serious problems to grapple with. First, how to keep his own Macolto alight, and secondly, how to extinguish the Macolti of others. The Macolto is like life. Man has found but one means of transmitting it, and that one comes from God. But he has discovered 1,000 means of taking it away, and the devil has somewhat aided him. The Macolto is kindled by approaching it to a light. But who can describe the 1,000 means of extinguishing the Macolto? The gigantic bellows, the monstrous extinguishers, the superhuman fans. Every one hastened to purchase Macolti, France, and Albert among the rest. The night was rapidly approaching, and already, at the cry of Macolti, repeated by the shrill voices of 1,000 vendors, 2 or 3 stars began to burn among the crowd. It was a signal. At the end of 10 minutes, 50,000 lights glittered, descending from the Palazzo di Venezia to the Piazza del Popolo, and mounting from the Piazza del Popolo to the Palazzo di Venezia. It seemed like the fate of jack-o'-lanterns. It is impossible to form any idea of it without having seen it. Suppose that all the stars had descended from the sky and mingled in a wild dance on the face of the earth, the whole accompanied by cries that were never heard in any other part of the world. The facchino follows the prince, the transsteverin the citizen, every one blowing, extinguishing, relighting. Had old Aeolus appeared at this moment, he would have been proclaimed king of the Macaulay and Aquilo, the heir presumptive to the throne. This battle of folly and flame continued for 2 hours. The Corso was light as day. The features of the spectators on the 3rd and 4th stories were visible. Every 5 minutes Albert took out his watch. At length it pointed to 7. The 2 friends were in the Via dei Pontefici. Albert sprang out, bearing his Macolto in his hand. 2 or 3 masks strove to knock his Macolto out of his hand, but Albert, a first-rate pugilist, sent them rolling in the street, one after the other, and continued his course towards the church of San Giacomo. The steps were crowded with masks who strove to snatch each other's torches. France followed Albert with his eyes and saw him mount the first step. Instantly, a mask, wearing the well-known costume of a peasant woman, snatched his macolto from him without his offering any resistance. France was too far off to hear what they said, but, without doubt, nothing hostile passed, for he saw Albert disappear arm in arm with the peasant girl. He watched them pass through the crowd for some time, but at length he lost sight of them in the Via Macello. Suddenly the bell that gives the signal for the end of the carnival sounded, and at the same instant all the Macolti were extinguished as if by enchantment. It seemed as though one immense blast of the wind had extinguished every one. France found himself in utter darkness. No sound was audible save that of the carriages that were carrying the maskers home. Nothing was visible save a few lights that burnt behind the windows. Chapter 37. The Catacombs of Saint Sebastian. In his whole life, perhaps, France had never before experienced so sudden an impression, so rapid a transition from gaiety to sadness as in this moment. It seemed as though Rome, under the magic breath of some demon of the night, had suddenly changed into a vast tomb. By a chance which added yet more to the intensity of the darkness, the moon, which was on the wane, did not rise until 11 o'clock, and the streets which the young man traversed were plunged in the deepest obscurity. The distance was short, and at the end of 10 minutes his carriage, or rather the Count's, stopped before the Hotel de Londres. Dinner was waiting, but, as Albert had told him that he should not return so soon, France sat down without him. Signor Pastrini, who had been accustomed to see them dine together, inquired into the cause of his absence, but France merely replied that Albert had received on the previous evening an invitation, which he had accepted. The sudden extinction of the Macolti, the darkness which had replaced the light, and the silence which had succeeded the turmoil, had left in France's mind a certain depression, which was not free from uneasiness. He therefore dined very silently, in spite of the officious attention of his host, who presented himself 2 or 3 times to inquire if he wanted anything. France resolved to wait for Albert as late as possible. He ordered the carriage, therefore, for 11 o'clock, desiring Signor Pastrini to inform him the moment that Albert returned to the hotel. At 11 o'clock Albert had not come back. France dressed himself and went out, telling his host that he was going to pass the night at the Duke of Bracciano's. The house of the Duke of Bracciano is one of the most delightful in Rome. The Duchess, one of the last heiresses of the Colonnas, does its honors with the most consummate grace, and thus their fates have a European celebrity. France and Albert had brought to Rome letters of introduction to them, and their first question on his arrival was to inquire the whereabouts of his traveling companion. France replied that he had left him at the moment they were about to extinguish the Macaulay, and that he had lost sight of him in the Via Macello. "Then he has not returned?" said the Duke. "I waited for him until this hour," replied France. "And do you know where he went?" "No, not precisely. However, I think it was something very like a rendezvous." "Diavolo," said the Duke, "this is a bad day, or rather a bad night, to be out late. Is it not, Countess?" These words were addressed to the Countess G., who had just arrived and was leaning on the arm of Signor Torlonia, the Duke's brother. "I think, on the contrary, that it is a charming night," replied the Countess, "and those who are here will complain of but one thing, its too rapid flight." "I am not speaking," said the Duke with a smile, "of the persons who are here. The men run no other danger than that of falling in love with you, and the women of falling ill of jealousy at seeing you so lovely." "I meant persons who were out in the streets of Rome." "Ah," asked the Countess, "who is out in the streets of Rome at this hour, unless it be to go to a ball?" our friend, Albert de Morcerf, Countess, whom I left in pursuit of his unknown about 7 o'clock this evening, said France, and whom I have not seen since. And don't you know where he is? Not at all. Is he armed? He is in masquerade. You should not have allowed him to go, said the Duke to France. You, who know Rome better than he does. You may as well have tried to stop number 3 of the Barbary, who gained the prize in the race today, replied France. And then, moreover, what could happen to him? Who can tell? The night is gloomy, and the Tiber is very near the Via Macello. France felt a shudder run through his veins at observing that the feeling of the Duke and the Countess was so much in unison with his own personal disquietude. I informed them at the hotel that I had the honor of passing the night here, Duke, said France, and desired them to come and inform me of his return. Ah, replied the Duke, here, I think, is one of my servants who is seeking you. The Duke was not mistaken. When he saw France, the servant came up to him. Your Excellency, he said, the master of the Hotel de Londres has sent to let you know that a man is waiting for you with a letter from the Viscount of Morcerf. A letter from the Viscount, exclaimed France. Yes, and who is the man? I do not know. Why did he not bring it to me here? The messenger did not say. And where is the messenger? He went away directly he saw me enter the ballroom to find you. Oh, said the Countess to France, go with all speed. Poor young man, perhaps some accident has happened to him. I will hasten, replied France. Shall we see you again to give us any information? Inquired the Countess. Yes, if it is not any serious affair, otherwise I cannot answer as to what I may do myself. Be prudent in any event, said the Countess. Oh, pray be assured of that. France took his hat and went away in haste. He had sent away his carriage with orders for it to fetch him at 2 o'clock. Fortunately, the Palazzo Bracciano, which is on one side in the Corso and on the other in the Square of the Holy Apostles, is hardly 10 minutes' walk from the Hotel de Londres. As he came near the hotel, France saw a man in the middle of the street. He had no doubt that it was a messenger from Albert. The man was wrapped up in a large cloak. He went up to him, but to his extreme astonishment, the stranger first addressed him. What wants your Excellency of me? Inquired the man, retreating a step or two, as if to keep on his guard. Are not you the person who brought me a letter? Inquired France. From the Viscount of Morcerf. Your Excellency lodges at Pastrini's Hotel? I do. Your Excellency is the traveling companion of the Viscount. I am. Your Excellency's name is the Baron France d'Epinay. Then it is to Your Excellency that this letter is addressed. Is there any answer? Inquired France, taking the letter from him. Yes, your friend at least hopes so. Come upstairs with me, and I will give it to you. I prefer waiting here, said the messenger, with a smile. And why? Your Excellency will know when you have read the letter. Shall I find you here, then? Certainly. France entered the hotel. On the staircase he met Signor Pastrini. Well, said the landlord. Well, what? Responded France. You have seen the man who desired to speak with you from your friend? He asked of France. Yes, I have seen him, he replied, and he has handed this letter to me. Light the candles in my apartment, if you please. The innkeeper gave orders to a servant to go before France with a light. The young man had found Signor Pastrini looking very much alarmed, and this had only made him the more anxious to read Albert's letter, and so he went instantly towards the wax light and unfolded it. It was written and signed by Albert. France read it twice before he could comprehend what it contained. It was thus worded: My dear fellow, the moment you have received this, have the kindness to take the letter of credit from my pocket-book, which you will find in the square drawer of the secretary. Add your own to it. If it be not sufficient, run to Torlonia, draw from him instantly 4,000 piasters and give them to the bearer. It is urgent that I should have this money without delay. I do not say more, relying on you as you may rely on me, your friend Albert de Morcerf. P.S. I now believe in Italian banditti. Below these lines were written, in a strange hand, the following in Italian. Si alle della mattina le 4 mile piaster non sono nel mai. Manny, Alicet il Conte Alberto Avressato di Viver. Luigi Vampa. If by 6 in the morning the 4,000 piasters are not in my hands, by 7 o'clock the Count Albert will have ceased to live. This second signature explained everything to France, who now understood the objection of the messenger to coming up into the apartment. The street was safer for him. Albert, then, had fallen into the hands of the famous bandit chief, in whose existence he had for so long a time refused to believe. There was no time to lose. He hastened to open the secretary and found the pocket-book in the drawer, and in it the letter of credit. There were in all 6,000 piasters, but of these 6,000 Albert had already expended 3,000. As to France, he had no letter of credit, as he lived at Florence and had only come to Rome to pass 7 or 8 days. He had brought but 100 louis, and of these he had not more than 50 left. Thus 700 or 800 piasters were wanting to them both to make up the sum that Albert required. True, he may in such a case rely on the kindness of Signor Torlonia. He was, therefore, about to return to the Palazzo Bracciano without loss of time, when suddenly a luminous idea crossed his mind. He remembered the Count of Monte Cristo. France was about to ring for Signor Pastrini when that worthy presented himself. "My dear sir," he said hastily, "do you know if the Count is within?" "Yes, your Excellency, he has this moment returned." "Is he in bed?" "I should say no." "Then ring at his door, if you please, and request him to be so kind as to give me an audience." Signor Pastrini did as he was desired, and returning 5 minutes after, he said, "The Count awaits your Excellency." France went along the corridor, and a servant introduced him to the Count. He was in a small room, which France had not yet seen, and which was surrounded with divans. The Count came towards him. "Well, what good wind blows you here at this hour?" said he. "Have you come to sup with me? It would be very kind of you." "No, I have come to speak to you of a very serious matter." "A serious matter," said the Count, looking at France with the earnestness usual to him. "And what may it be? Are we alone?" "Yes," replied the Count, going to the door and returning. France gave him Albert's letter. "Read that," he said. The Count read it. "Well, well," said he, "did you see the postscript?" "I did, truly. Si alle della mattina le 4 mile piaster non sono nel mai. Manny, Alicet il Conte Alberto Avressato di Viver. Luigi Vampa." "What think you of that?" inquired France. "Have you the money he demands?" "Yes, all but 800 piasters." The Count went to his secretary, opened it, and pulling out a drawer filled with gold, said to France, "I hope you will not offend me by applying to any one but myself." "You see, on the contrary, I come to you first and instantly," replied France. "And I thank you. Have what you will," and he made a sign to France to take what he pleased. "Is it absolutely necessary, then, to send the money to Luigi Vampa?" asked the young man, looking fixedly in his turn at the Count. "Judge for yourself," replied he. "The postscript is explicit. I think that if you would take the trouble of reflecting, you could find a way of simplifying the negotiation," said France. "How so?" returned the Count with surprise. "If we were to go together to Luigi Vampa, I am sure he would not refuse you Albert's freedom. What influence can I possibly have over a bandit? Have you not just rendered him a service that can never be forgotten?" "What is that?" "Have you not saved Pechino's life?" "Well, well," said the Count, "who told you that?" "No matter, I know it." The Count knit his brows and remained silent an instant. "And if I went to seek Vampa, would you accompany me? If my society would not be disagreeable, be it so. It is a lovely night, and a walk without Rome will do us both good. Shall I take any arms? For what purpose? Any money? It is useless. Where is the man who brought the letter? In the street. He awaits the answer. Yes, I must learn where we are going. I will summon him here. It is useless. He would not come up to your apartments, perhaps, but he will not make any difficulty at entering mine. The Count went to the window of the apartment that looked onto the street and whistled in a peculiar manner. The man in the mantle quitted the wall and advanced into the middle of the street. Sell it, said the Count in the same tone in which he would have given an order to his servant. The messenger obeyed without the least hesitation, but rather with alacrity, and mounting the steps at a bound, entered the hotel. 5 seconds afterwards he was at the door of the room. Ah, it is you, Peppino, said the Count. But Peppino, instead of answering, threw himself on his knees, seized the Count's hand, and covered it with kisses. Ah, said the Count, you have, then, not forgotten that I saved your life. That is strange, for it is a week ago. No, Excellency, and never shall I forget it, returned Peppino, with an accent of profound gratitude. Never, that is a long time, but it is something that you believe so. Rise and answer. Peppino glanced anxiously at France. Oh, you may speak before His Excellency, said he. He is one of my friends. You allow me to give you this title, continued the Count in French. It is necessary to excite this man's confidence. You can speak before me, said France. I am a friend of the Count's. Good, returned Peppino. I am ready to answer any questions your Excellency may address to me. How did the Viscount Albert fall into Luigi's hands? Excellency, the Frenchman's carriage passed several times the one in which was Teresa, the chief's mistress. Yes, the Frenchman threw her a bouquet. Teresa returned it. All this with the consent of the chief, who was in the carriage. What? Cried France. Was Luigi Vampa in the carriage with the Roman peasants? It was he who drove, disguised as the coachman, replied Peppino. Well, said the Count. Well, then, the Frenchman took off his mask. Teresa, with the chief's consent, did the same. The Frenchman asked for a rendezvous. Teresa gave him one only. Instead of Teresa, it was Beppo who was on the steps of the church of San Giacomo. What? Exclaimed France. The peasant girl who snatched his Macolto from him was a lad of 15, replied Peppino. But it was no disgrace to your friend to have been deceived. Beppo has taken in plenty of others. And Beppo led him outside the walls, said the Count. Exactly so. A carriage was waiting at the end of the Via Masolo. Beppo got in, inviting the Frenchman to follow him, and he did not wait to be asked twice. He gallantly offered the right-hand seat to Beppo, and sat by him. Beppo told him he was going to take him to a villa a league from Rome. The Frenchman assured him he would follow him to the end of the world. The coachman went up the Via di Ripetta and the Porta San Paolo, and when they were 200 yards outside, as the Frenchman became somewhat too forward, Beppo put a brace of pistols to his head. The coachman pulled up and did the same. At the same time, 4 of the band, who were concealed on the banks of the Almo, surrounded the carriage. The Frenchman made some resistance and nearly strangled Beppo, but he could not resist 5 armed men and was forced to yield. They made him get out, walk along the banks of the river, and then brought him to Teresa and Luigi, who were waiting for him in the catacombs of St. Sebastian. Well, said the Count, turning towards France, it seems to me that this is a very likely story. What do you say to it? Why, that I should think it very amusing, replied France, if it had happened to any one but poor Albert. And, in truth, if you had not found me here, said the Count, it may have proved a gallant adventure which would have cost your friend dear. But now, be assured, his alarm will be the only serious consequence. And shall we go and find him? Inquired France. Oh, decidedly, sir. He is in a very picturesque place. Do you know the catacombs of St. Sebastian? I was never in them, but I have often resolved to visit them. Well, here is an opportunity made to your hand, and it would be difficult to contrive a better. Have you a carriage? No, that is of no consequence. I always have one ready, day and night. Always ready? Yes, I am a very capricious being, and I should tell you that sometimes, when I rise, or after my dinner, or in the middle of the night, I resolve on starting for some particular point, and away I go. The Count rang, and a footman appeared. Order out the carriage, he said, and remove the pistols which are in the holsters. You need not awaken the coachman. Ollie will drive. In a very short time the noise of wheels was heard and the carriage stopped at the door. The Count took out his watch. 12:30, he said. We may start at 5 o'clock and be in time, but the delay may cause your friend to pass an uneasy night, and therefore we had better go with all speed to extricate him from the hands of the infidels. Are you still resolved to accompany me? More determined than ever. Well, then, come along. France and the Count went downstairs, accompanied by Peppino. At the door, they found the carriage. Ollie was on the box, in whom France recognized the dumb slave of the grotto of Monte Cristo. France and the Count got into the carriage. Peppino placed himself beside Ollie, and they set off at a rapid pace. Ollie had received his instructions and went down the Corso, crossed the Campo Vaccino, went up the Strada San Gregorio, and reached the gates of St. Sebastian. Then the porter raised some difficulties, but the Count of Monte Cristo produced a permit from the governor of Rome, allowing him to leave or enter the city at any hour of the day or night. The portcullis was therefore raised. The porter had a louis for his trouble, and they went on their way. The road which the carriage now traversed was the ancient Appian way and bordered with tombs. From time to time, by the light of the moon, which began to rise, France imagined that he saw something like a sentinel appear at various points among the ruins, and suddenly retreat into the darkness on a signal from Peppino. A short time before they reached the baths of Caracalla the carriage stopped. Peppino opened the door, and the Count and France alighted. In 10 minutes, said the Count to his companion, we shall be there. He then took Peppino aside, gave him an order in a low voice, and Peppino went away, taking with him a torch brought with them in the carriage. 5 minutes elapsed, during which France saw the shepherd going along a narrow path that led over the irregular and broken surface of the Campagna, and finally he disappeared in the amid of the tall, red herbage, which seemed like the bristling mane of an enormous lion. Now, said the Count, let us follow him. France and the Count in their turn then advanced along the same path, which, at the distance of 100 paces, led them over a declivity to the bottom of a small valley. They then perceived two men conversing in the obscurity. Ought we to go on? Asked France of the Count, or shall we wait a while? Let us go on. Peppino will have warned the sentry of our coming. One of the two men was Peppino, and the other a bandit on the lookout. France and the Count advanced, and the bandit saluted them. Your Excellency, said Peppino, addressing the Count, if you will follow me, the opening of the catacombs is close at hand. Go on. Then, replied the Count. They came to an opening behind a clump of bushes and in the mid of a pile of rocks, by which a man could scarcely pass. Peppino glided first into this crevice. After they got along a few paces the passage widened. Peppino passed, lighted his torch, and turned to see if they came after him. The Count first reached an open space and France followed him closely. The passageway sloped in a gentle descent, enlarging as they proceeded. Still France and the Count were compelled to advance in a stooping posture, and were scarcely able to proceed abreast of one another. They went on 150 paces in this way, and then were stopped by, who comes there? At the same time they saw the reflection of a torch on a carbine barrel. "A friend," responded Peppino, and, advancing alone towards the sentry, he said a few words to him in a low tone, and then he, like the first, saluted the nocturnal visitors, making a sign that they may proceed. Behind the sentinel was a staircase with 20 steps. France and the Count descended these and found themselves in a mortuary chamber. 5 corridors diverged like the rays of a star, and the walls, dug into niches, which were arranged one above the other in the shape of coffins, showed that they were at last in the catacombs. Down one of the corridors, whose extent it was impossible to determine, rays of light were visible. The Count laid his hand on France's shoulder. "Would you like to see a camp of bandits in repose?" he inquired. "Exceedingly," replied France. "Come with me, then." Peppino put out the torch. Peppino obeyed, and France and the Count were in utter darkness, except that 50 paces in advance of them a reddish glare, more evident since Peppino had put out his torch, was visible along the wall. They advanced silently, the Count guiding France as if he had the singular faculty of seeing in the dark. France himself, however, saw his way more plainly in proportion as he went on towards the light, which served in some manner as a guide. 3 arcades were before them, and the middle one was used as a door. These arcades opened on one side into the corridor where the Count and France were, and on the other into a large square chamber entirely surrounded by niches similar to those of which we have spoken. In the amid of this chamber were 4 stones, which had formerly served as an altar, as was evident from the cross which still surmounted them. A lamp placed at the base of a pillar lighted up with its pale and flickering flame the singular scene which presented itself to the eyes of the 2 visitors. Concealed in the shadow, a man was seated with his elbow leaning on the column and was reading with his back turned to the arcades, through the openings of which the newcomers contemplated him. This was the chief of the band, Luigi Vampa. Around him, and in groups according to their fancy, lying in their mantles or with their backs against a sort of stone bench which went all round the columbarium, were to be seen 20 brigands or more, each having his carbine within reach. At the other end, silent, scarcely visible, and like a shadow, was a sentinel who was walking up and down before a grotto, which was only distinguishable because in that spot the darkness seemed more dense than elsewhere. When the Count thought France had gazed sufficiently on this picturesque tableau, he raised his finger to his lips to warn him to be silent, and, ascending the 3 steps which led to the corridor of the columbarium, entered the chamber by the middle arcade and advanced towards Vampa, who was so intent on the book before him that he did not hear the noise of his footsteps. "Who comes there?" cried the sentinel, who was less abstracted and who saw by the lamplight a shadow approaching his chief. At this challenge, Vampa rose quickly, drawing at the same moment a pistol from his girdle. In a moment all the bandits were on their feet, and 20 carbines were leveled at the Count. "Well," said he in a voice perfectly calm, and no muscle of his countenance disturbed, "well, my dear Vampa, it appears to me that you receive a friend with a great deal of ceremony." "Ground arms," exclaimed the chief, with an imperative sign of the hand, while with the other he took off his hat respectfully. Then, turning to the singular personage who had caused this scene, he said, "Your pardon, Your Excellency, but I was so far from expecting the honor of a visit that I did not really recognize you." "It seems that your memory is equally short in everything," Vampa said the Count, "and that not only do you forget people's faces, but also the conditions you make with them." "What conditions have I forgotten, Your Excellency?" inquired the bandit, with the air of a man who, having committed an error, is anxious to repair it. "Was it not agreed," asked the Count, "that not only my person, but also that of my friends, should be respected by you? And how have I broken that treaty, Your Excellency? You have this evening carried off and conveyed here the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf." Well, continued the Count in a tone that made France shudder, this young gentleman is one of my friends. This young gentleman lodges in the same hotel as myself. This young gentleman has been up and down the Corso for 8 hours in my private carriage, and yet, I repeat to you, you have carried him off and conveyed him here, and, added the Count, taking the letter from his pocket, you have set a ransom on him as if he were an utter stranger. Why did you not tell me all this, you? Inquired the brigand chief, turning towards his men, who all retreated before his look. Why have you caused me thus to fail in my word towards a gentleman like the Count, who has all our lives in his hands? By heavens, if I thought one of you knew that the young gentleman was the friend of his excellency, I would blow his brains out with my own hand. Well, said the Count, turning towards France, I told you there was some mistake in this. Are you not alone? Asked Vampa with uneasiness. I am with the person to whom this letter was addressed, and to whom I desired to prove that Luigi Vampa was a man of his word. Come, your excellency, the Count added, turning to France, here is Luigi Vampa, who will himself express to you his deep regret at the mistake he has committed. France approached, the chief advancing several steps to meet him. Welcome among us, your excellency, he said to him. You heard what the Count just said, and also my reply. Let me add that I would, not for the 4,000 piasters at which I had fixed your friend's ransom, that this had happened. But, said France, looking round him uneasily, where is the Viscount? I do not see him. Nothing has happened to him, I hope, said the Count frowningly. The prisoner is there, replied Vampa, pointing to the hollow space in front of which the bandit was on guard, and I will go myself and tell him he is free. The chief went towards the place he had pointed out as Albert's prison, and France and the Count followed him. What is the prisoner doing? Inquired Vampa of the sentinel. Ma foi, captain, replied the sentry, I do not know. For the last hour, I have not heard him stir. Come in, your excellency, said Vampa. The Count and France ascended 7 or 8 steps after the chief, who drew back a bolt and opened a door. Then, by the gleam of a lamp, similar to that which lighted the columbarium, Albert was to be seen wrapped up in a cloak which one of the bandits had lent him, lying in a corner in profound slumber. Come, said the Count, smiling with his own peculiar smile, not so bad for a man who is to be shot at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Vampa looked at Albert with a kind of admiration. He was not insensible to such a proof of courage. You are right, your excellency, he said. This must be one of your friends. Then going to Albert, he touched him on the shoulder, saying, Will your excellency please to awaken? Albert stretched out his arms, rubbed his eyelids, and opened his eyes. Oh, said he, is it you, captain? You should have allowed me to sleep. I had such a delightful dream. I was dancing the gallop at Torlonia's with the Countess G. Then he drew his watch from his pocket, that he may see how time sped. 1:30 only, said he. Why the devil do you rouse me at this hour? To tell you that you are free, your excellency. My dear fellow, replied Albert, with perfect ease of mind, remember, for the future, Napoleon's maxim, never awaken me but for bad news. If you had let me sleep on, I should have finished my gallop, and have been grateful to you all my life. So, then, they have paid my ransom? No, your excellency. Well, then, how am I free? A person to whom I can refuse nothing has come to demand you. Come here. Yes, here. Really? Then that person is a most amiable person. Albert looked around and perceived France. What, said he, is it you, my dear France, whose devotion and friendship are thus displayed? No, not I, replied France, but our neighbor, the Count of Monte Cristo. Oh, my dear Count, said Albert gaily, arranging his cravat and wristbands, you are really most kind, and I hope you will consider me as under eternal obligations to you, in the first place for the carriage, and in the next for this visit, and he put out his hand to the Count, who shuddered as he gave his own, but who nevertheless did give it. The bandit gazed on this scene with amazement. He was evidently accustomed to see his prisoners tremble before him, and yet here was one whose gay temperament was not for a moment altered. As for France, he was enchanted at the way in which Albert had sustained the national honor in the presence of the bandit. "My dear Albert," he said, "if you will make haste, we shall yet have time to finish the night at Torlonia's. You may conclude your interrupted gallop, so that you will owe no ill will to Signor Luigi, who has, truly, throughout this whole affair acted like a gentleman. You are decidedly right, and we may reach the palazzo by 2 o'clock. Signor Luigi," continued Albert, "is there any formality to fulfill before I take leave of your Excellency?" "None, sir," replied the bandit. "You are as free as air. Well, then, a happy and merry life to you. Come, gentlemen, come." And Albert, followed by France and the Count, descended the staircase, crossed the square chamber, where stood all the bandits, hat in hand. "Peppino," said the brigand chief, "give me the torch." "What are you going to do?" inquired the Count. "I will show you the way back myself," said the captain. "That is the least honor that I can render to your Excellency." And taking the lighted torch from the hands of the herdsman, he preceded his guests, not as a servant who performs an act of civility, but like a king who precedes ambassadors. On reaching the door, he bowed. "And now, your Excellency," added he, "allow me to repeat my apologies, and I hope you will not entertain any resentment at what has occurred." "No, my dear Vampa," replied the Count. "Besides, you compensate for your mistakes in so gentlemanly a way that one almost feels obliged to you for having committed them. Gentlemen," added the chief, turning towards the young men, "perhaps the offer may not appear very tempting to you, but if you should ever feel inclined to pay me a second visit, wherever I may be, you shall be welcome." France and Albert bowed. The Count went out first, then Albert. France paused for a moment. "Has your Excellency anything to ask me?" said Vampa with a smile. "Yes, I have," replied France. "I am curious to know what work you were perusing with so much attention as we entered." "Caesar's Commentaries," said the bandit. "It is my favorite work." "Well, are you coming?" asked Albert. "Yes," replied France, "here I am," and he, in his turn, left the caves. They advanced to the plain. "Ah, your pardon," said Albert, turning round. "Will you allow me, Captain?" And he lighted his cigar at Vampa's torch. "Now, my dear Count," he said, "let us on with all the speed we may. I am enormously anxious to finish my night at the Duke of Bracciano's." They found the carriage where they had left it. The Count said a word in Arabic to Ali, and the horses went on at great speed. It was just 2 o'clock by Albert's watch when the two friends entered into the dancing room. Their return was quite an event, but as they entered together, all uneasiness on Albert's account ceased instantly. "Madam," said the Viscount of Morcerf, advancing towards the Countess, "yesterday you were so condescending as to promise me a gallop. I am rather late in claiming this gracious promise, but here is my friend, whose character for veracity you well know, and he will assure you the delay arose from no fault of mine." And as at this moment the orchestra gave the signal for the waltz, Albert put his arm round the waist of the Countess and disappeared with her in the whirl of dancers. Chapter 38. The Compact. The first words that Albert uttered to his friend on the following morning contained a request that France would accompany him on a visit to the Count. True, the young man had warmly and energetically thanked the Count on the previous evening, but services such as he had rendered could never be too often acknowledged. France, who seemed attracted by some invisible influence towards the Count, in which terror was strangely mingled, felt an extreme reluctance to permit his friend to be exposed alone to the singular fascination that this mysterious personage seemed to exercise over him, and therefore made no objection to Albert's request, but at once accompanied him to the desired spot, and after a short delay, the Count joined them in the salon. "My dear Count," said Albert, advancing to meet him, "permit me to repeat the poor thanks I offered last night, and to assure you that the remembrance of all I owe to you will never be effaced from my memory. Believe me, as long as I live, I shall never cease to dwell with grateful recollection on the prompt and important service you rendered me, and also to remember that to you I am indebted evening for my life." "My very good friend and excellent neighbor," replied the Count, with a smile, "you really exaggerate my trifling exertions. You owe me nothing but some trifle of 20 francs, which you have been saved out of your traveling expenses, so that there is not much of a score between us. But you must really permit me to congratulate you on the ease and unconcern with which you resigned yourself to your fate, and the perfect indifference you manifested as to the turn events may take." "Upon my word," said Albert, "I deserve no credit for what I could not help, namely, a determination to take everything as I found it, and to let those bandits see that although men get into troublesome scrapes all over the world, there is no nation but the French that can smile evening in the face of grim death himself. All that, however, has nothing to do with my obligations to you, and I now come to ask you whether, in my own person, my family, or connections, I can in any way serve you. My father, the Comte de Morcerf, although of Spanish origin, possesses considerable influence both at the court of France and Madrid, and I unhesitatingly place the best services of myself and all to whom my life is dear at your disposal." "Monsieur de Morcerf," replied the Count, "your offer, far from surprising me, is precisely what I expected from you, and I accept it in the same spirit of hearty sincerity with which it is made. No, I will go still further, and say that I had previously made up my mind to ask a great favor at your hands." "Oh, pray name it." "I am wholly a stranger to Paris. It is a city I have never yet seen." "Is it possible," exclaimed Albert, "that you have reached your present age without visiting the finest capital in the world?" "I can scarcely credit it. Nevertheless, it is quite true. Still, I agree with you in thinking that my present ignorance of the first city in Europe is a reproach to me in every way and calls for immediate correction. But, in all probability, I should have performed so important, so necessary a duty as that of making myself acquainted with the wonders and beauties of your justly celebrated capital, had I known any person who would have introduced me into the fashionable world. But unfortunately I possessed no acquaintance there, and of necessity was compelled to abandon the idea. So distinguished an individual as yourself," cried Albert, "could scarcely have required an introduction." "You are most kind, but as regards myself, I can find no merit I possess save that, as a millionaire, I may have become a partner in the speculations of M. Aguado and M. Rothschild. But as my motive in traveling to your capital would not have been for the pleasure of dabbling in stocks, I stayed away till some favorable chance should present itself of carrying my wish into execution. Your offer, however, smooths all difficulties, and I have only to ask you, my dear M. de Morcerf," these words were accompanied by a most peculiar smile, "whether you undertake, upon my arrival in France, to open to me the doors of that fashionable world of which I know no more than a Huron or a native of Cochin China." "Oh, that I do, and with infinite pleasure," answered Albert, "and so much the more readily as a letter received this morning from my father summons me to Paris, in consequence of a treaty of marriage. My dear France, do not smile. I beg of you, with a family of high standing, and connected with the very cream of Parisian society." "Connected by marriage, you mean," said France, laughingly. Well, never mind how it is, answered Albert. It comes to the same thing in the end. Perhaps by the time you return to Paris, I shall be quite a sober, staid father of a family, a most edifying representative. I shall make of all the domestic virtues, don't you think so? But as regards your wish to visit our fine city, my dear Count, I can only say that you may command me and mine to any extent you please. Then it is settled, said the Count, and I give you my solemn assurance that I only waited an opportunity like the present to realize plans that I have long meditated. France did not doubt that these plans were the same concerning which the Count had dropped a few words in the grotto of Monte Cristo, and while the Count was speaking the young man watched him closely, hoping to read something of his purpose in his face, but his countenance was inscrutable, especially when, as in the present case, it was veiled in a sphinx-like smile. But tell me now, Count, exclaimed Albert, delighted at the idea of having to chaperone so distinguished a person as Monte Cristo. Tell me truly whether you are in earnest, or if this project of visiting Paris is merely one of the chimerical and uncertain air castles of which we make so many in the course of our lives, but which, like a house built on the sand, is liable to be blown over by the first puff of wind. I pledge you my honor, returned the Count, that I mean to do as I have said. Both inclination and positive necessity compel me to visit Paris. When do you propose going there? Have you made up your mind when you shall be there yourself? Certainly I have. In a fortnight or 3 weeks' time. That is to say, as fast as I can get there. No, said the Count, I will give you 3 months before I join you. You see, I make an ample allowance for all delays and difficulties. And in 3 months' time, said Albert, you will be at my house. Shall we make a positive appointment for a particular day and hour? Inquired the Count. Only let me warn you that I am proverbial for my punctilious exactitude in keeping my engagements. Day for day, hour for hour, said Albert. That will suit me to a dot. So be it, then, replied the Count, and extending his hand towards a calendar suspended near the chimney-piece, he said, "Today is the 21st of February," and drawing out his watch, added, "It is exactly 10 o'clock. Now promise me to remember this, and expect me the 21st of May at the same hour in the forenoon." "Capital," exclaimed Albert, "your breakfast shall be waiting. Where do you live?" "No, 27, Rue du Helder. Have you bachelor's apartments there? I hope my coming will not put you to any inconvenience." "I reside in my father's house, but occupy a pavilion at the farther side of the courtyard, entirely separated from the main building." "Quite sufficient," replied the Count, as, taking out his tablets, he wrote down, "No, 27, Rue du Helder, 21st May, 10:30 in the morning." "Now then," said the Count, returning his tablets to his pocket, "make yourself perfectly easy. The hand of your timepiece will not be more accurate in marking the time than myself." "Shall I see you again before my departure?" asked Albert. "That depends. When do you leave?" "To-morrow evening, at 5 o'clock. In that case I must say adieu to you, as I am compelled to go to Naples, and shall not return here before Saturday evening or Sunday morning." "And you, Baron," pursued the Count, addressing France, "do you also depart to-morrow?" "Yes, for France." "No, for Venice. I shall remain in Italy for another year or 2. Then we shall not meet in Paris." "I fear I shall not have that honor." "Well, since we must part," said the Count, holding out a hand to each of the young men, "allow me to wish you both a safe and pleasant journey." It was the first time the hand of France had come in contact with that of the mysterious individual before him, and unconsciously he shuddered at its touch, for it felt cold and icy as that of a corpse. "Let us understand each other," said Albert. "It is agreed, is it not, that you are to be at No. 27 in the Rue du Helder on the 21st of May at 10:30 in the morning, and your word of honor passed for your punctuality?" The 21st of May, at 10:30 in the morning, Rue du Helder, No. 27, replied the Count. The young men then rose, and bowing to the Count, quitted the room. "What is the matter?" asked Albert of France, when they had returned to their own apartments. "You seem more than commonly thoughtful." "I will confess to you, Albert," replied France, "the Count is a very singular person, and the appointment you have made to meet him in Paris fills me with 1,000 apprehensions." "My dear fellow," exclaimed Albert, "what can there possibly be in that to excite uneasiness? Why, you must have lost your senses." "Whether I am in my senses or not," answered France, "that is the way I feel." "Listen to me, France," said Albert. "I am glad that the occasion has presented itself for saying this to you, for I have noticed how cold you are in your bearing towards the Count, while he, on the other hand, has always been courtesy itself to us. Have you anything particular against him?" "Possibly. Did you ever meet him previously to coming here?" "I have." "And where? Will you promise me not to repeat a single word of what I am about to tell you?" "I promise." "Upon your honor?" "Upon my honor." "Then listen to me." France then related to his friend the history of his excursion to the island of Monte Cristo, and of his finding a party of smugglers there, and the 2 Corsican bandits with them. He dwelt with considerable force and energy on the almost magical hospitality he had received from the Count, and the magnificence of his entertainment in the grotto of the 1,001 Nights. He recounted, with circumstantial exactitude, all the particulars of the supper, the hashish, the statues, the dream, and how, at his awakening, there remained no proof or trace of all these events, save the small yacht seen in the distant horizon driving under full sail toward Porto Vecchio. Then he detailed the conversation overheard by him at the Colosseum between the Count and Vampa, in which the Count had promised to obtain the release of the bandit Peppino, an engagement which, as our readers are aware, he most faithfully fulfilled. At last he arrived at the adventure of the preceding night, and the embarrassment in which he found himself placed by not having sufficient cash by 600 or 700 piasters to make up the sum required, and finally of his application to the Count and the picturesque and satisfactory result that followed. Albert listened with the most profound attention. "Well," said he, when France had concluded, "what do you find to object to in all you have related?" "The Count is fond of traveling, and, being rich, possesses a vessel of his own. Go but to Portsmouth or Southampton, and you will find the harbors crowded with the yachts belonging to such of the English as can afford the expense, and have the same liking for this amusement." Now, by way of having a resting place during his excursions, avoiding the wretched cookery, which has been trying its best to poison me during the last 4 months, while you have manfully resisted its effects for as many years, and obtaining a bed on which it is possible to slumber, Monte Cristo has furnished for himself a temporary abode where you first found him, but, to prevent the possibility of the Tuscan government taking a fancy to his enchanted palace, and by that depriving him of the advantages naturally expected from so large an outlay of capital, he has wisely enough purchased the island and taken its name. Just ask yourself, my good fellow, whether there are not many persons of our acquaintance who assume the names of lands and properties they never in their lives were masters of. "But," said France, "the Corsican bandits that were among the crew of his vessel, why, really the thing seems to me simple enough. Nobody knows better than yourself that the bandits of Corsica are not rogues or thieves, but purely and simply fugitives, driven by some sinister motive from their native town or village, and that their fellowship involves no disgrace or stigma. For my own part, I protest that, should I ever go to Corsica, my first visit, before evening I presented myself to the mayor or prefect, should be to the bandits of Colomba, if I could only manage to find them, for, on my conscience, they are a race of men I admire greatly, Still, persisted France, I suppose you will allow that such men as Vampa and his band are regular villains, who have no other motive than plunder when they seize your person. How do you explain the influence the Count evidently possessed over those ruffians? My good friend, as in all probability I own my present safety to that influence, it would ill become me to search too closely into its source. Therefore, instead of condemning him for his intimacy with outlaws, you must give me leave to excuse any little irregularity there may be in such a connection, not altogether for preserving my life, for my own idea was that it never was in much danger, but certainly for saving me. For 0 piasters, which, being translated, means neither more nor less than 24 livers of our money, a sum at which, most assuredly, I should never have been estimated in France, proving most indisputably, added Albert with a laugh, that no prophet is honored in his own country. Talking of countries, replied France, of what country is the Count? What is his native tongue? From where does he derive his immense fortune? And what were those events of his early life, a life as marvelous, as unknown, that have tinctured his succeeding years with so dark and gloomy a misanthropy? Certainly these are questions that, in your place, I should like to have answered. My dear Franz, replied Albert, when, upon receipt of my letter, you found the necessity of asking the Count's assistance, you promptly went to him, saying, my friend Albert de Morcerf is in danger, help me to deliver him. Was not that nearly what you said? It was. Well, then, did he ask you who is Albert de Morcerf? How does he come by his name, his fortune? What are his means of existence? What is his birthplace? Of what country is he a native? Tell me, did he put all these questions to you? I confess he asked me none. No, he merely came and freed me from the hands of Signor Vampa, where, I can assure you, in spite of all my outward appearance of ease and unconcern, I did not very particularly care to remain. Now, then, France, when, for services so promptly and unhesitatingly rendered, he but asks me in return to do for him what is done daily for any Russian prince or Italian nobleman who may pass through Paris, merely to introduce him into society, would you have me refuse? My good fellow, you must have lost your senses to think it possible I could act with such cold-blooded policy. And this time it must be confessed that, contrary to the usual state of affairs in discussions between the young men, the effective arguments were all on Albert's side. Well, said France with a sigh, do as you please, my dear Viscount, for your arguments are beyond my powers of refutation. Still, in spite of all, you must admit that this Count of Monte Cristo is a most singular personage. He is a philanthropist, answered the other, and no doubt his motive in visiting Paris is to compete for the month-end prize given, as you are aware, to whoever shall be proved to have most materially advanced the interests of virtue and humanity. If my vote and interest can obtain it for him, I will readily give him the one and promise the other. And now, my dear France, let us talk of something else. Come, shall we take our luncheon and then pay a last visit to St. Peter's? France silently assented, and the following afternoon, at 5:30, the young men parted, Albert de Morcerf to return to Paris, and France d'Épinay to pass a fortnight at Venice. Chapter 39. The guests. In the house in the Rue du Helder, where Albert had invited the Count of Monte Cristo, everything was being prepared on the morning of the 21st of May to do honor to the occasion. Albert de Morcerf inhabited a pavilion situated at the corner of a large court, and directly opposite another building in which were the servants' apartments. 2 windows only of the pavilion faced the street. 3 other windows looked into the court, and 2 at the back into the garden. Between the court and the garden, built in the heavy style of the imperial architecture, was the large and fashionable dwelling of the Count and Countess of Morcerf. A high wall surrounded the whole of the hotel, surmounted at intervals by vases filled with flowers and broken in the center by a large gate of gilded iron, which served as the carriage entrance. A small door, close to the lodge of the concierge, gave ingress and egress to the servants and masters when they were on foot. It was easy to discover that the delicate care of a mother, unwilling to part from her son, and yet aware that a young man of the Viscount's age required the full exercise of his liberty, had chosen this habitation for Albert. There were not lacking, however, evidences of what we may call the intelligent egoism of a youth who is charmed with the indolent, careless life of an only son and who lives as it were in a gilded cage. By means of the two windows looking into the street, Albert could see all that passed. The sight of what is going on is necessary to young men who always want to see the world traverse their horizon, even if that horizon is only a public thoroughfare. Then, should anything appear to merit a more minute examination, Albert de Morcerf could follow up his researches by means of a small gate, similar to that close to the concierge's door, and which merits a particular description. It was a little entrance that seemed never to have been opened since the house was built, so entirely was it covered with dust and dirt, but the well-oiled hinges and locks told quite another story. This door was a mockery to the concierge, from whose vigilance and jurisdiction it was free, and, like that famous portal in the Arabian Nights, opening at the sesame of Ali Baba, it was wont to swing backward at a cabalistic word or a concerted tap from without from the sweetest voices or whitest fingers in the world. At the end of a long corridor with which the door communicated and which formed the ante-chamber was on the right Albert's breakfast room, looking into the court, and on the left the salon, looking into the garden. Shrubs and creeping plants covered the windows and hid from the garden and court these two apartments, the only rooms into which, as they were on the ground floor, the prying eyes of the curious could penetrate. On the floor above were similar rooms, with the addition of a third, formed out of the antechamber. These three rooms were a salon, a boudoir, and a bedroom. The salon, downstairs, was only an Algerian divan for the use of smokers. The boudoir upstairs communicated with the bedchamber by an invisible door. On the staircase, it was evident that every precaution had been taken. Above this floor was a large atelier, which had been increased in size by pulling down the partitions, a pandemonium in which the artist and the dandy strove for preeminence. There were collected and piled up all Albert's successive caprices: hunting horns, bass viols, flutes, a whole orchestra, for Albert had not a taste but a fancy for music. Easels, palettes, brushes, pencils for music had been succeeded by painting, foils, boxing gloves, broadswords, and single sticks for following the example of the fashionable young men of the time. Albert de Morcerf cultivated, with far more perseverance than music and drawing, the three arts that complete a dandy's education, i.e. fencing, boxing, and single stick, and it was here that he received Grossierre, Cook, and Charles Leboucher. The rest of the furniture of this privileged apartment consisted of old cabinets filled with Chinese porcelain and Japanese vases, Luca della Robbia fans, and Palissy platters of old armchairs, in which perhaps had sat Henry Roman IV or Sully, Louis Roman XIII, or Richelieu, for two of these armchairs, adorned with a carved shield, on which were engraved the fleur-de-lis of France on an azure field, evidently came from the Louvre, or, at least, some royal residence. Over these dark and somber chairs were thrown splendid stuffs, dyed beneath Persia's sun, or woven by the fingers of the women of Calcutta or of Chandernagor. What these stuffs did there, it was impossible to say. They awaited, while gratifying the eyes, a destination unknown to their owner himself. In the meantime they filled the place with their golden and silky reflections. In the center of the room was a roller and Blanchet, baby grand piano in rosewood but holding the potentialities of an orchestra in its narrow and sonorous cavity, and groaning beneath the weight of the chef's d'oeuvre of Beethoven, Weber, Mozart, Haydn, Gratry, and Porpora. On the walls, over the doors, on the ceiling, were swords, daggers, Malay creeses, maces, battle axes, gilded, damasked, and inlaid suits of armor, dried plants, minerals, and stuffed birds, their flame-colored wings outspread in motionless flight, and their beaks forever open. This was Albert's favorite lounging place. However, the morning of the appointment, the young man had established himself in the small salon downstairs. There, on a table, surrounded at some distance by a large and luxurious divan, every species of tobacco, known, from the yellow tobacco of Petersburg to the black of Sinai, and so on along the scale from Maryland and Puerto Rico to Latakia, was exposed in pots of crackled earthenware of which the Dutch are so fond. Beside them, in boxes of fragrant wood, were ranged, according to their size and quality, puros, regalias, Havanas, and Manilas, and in an open cabinet, a collection of German pipes of chibouks, with their amber mouthpieces ornamented with coral, and of narghiles, with their long tubes of Morocco, awaiting the caprice or the sympathy of the smokers. Albert had himself presided at the arrangement, or rather, the symmetrical derangement, which, after coffee, the guests at a breakfast of modern days love to contemplate through the vapor that escapes from their mouths and ascends in long and fanciful wreaths to the ceiling. At 9:45, a valet entered. He composed with a little groom named John, and who only spoke English, all Albert's establishment, although the cook of the hotel was always at his service, and on great occasions the Count's chasseur also. This valet, whose name was Germain, and who enjoyed the entire confidence of his young master, held in one hand a number of papers and in the other a packet of letters, which he gave to Albert. Albert glanced carelessly at the different missives, selected two written in a small and delicate hand and enclosed in scented envelopes, opened them and perused their contents with some attention. "How did these letters come?" said he. "One by the post. Madame Danglars' footman left the other. Let Madame Danglars know that I accept the place she offers me in her box. Wait, then, during the day, tell Rosa that when I leave the opera, I will sup with her as she wishes. Take her 6 bottles of different wine, Cyprus, sherry, and Malaga, and a barrel of Ostend oysters. Get them at Borel's, and be sure you say they are for me. At what o'clock, sir? Do you breakfast? What time is it now? 9:45. Very well, at 10:30. Debray will, perhaps, be obliged to go to the minister, and besides, Albert looked at his tablets. It is the hour I told the Count, 21st May, at 10:30, and though I do not much rely upon his promise, I wish to be punctual. Is the Countess up yet? If you wish, I will inquire. Yes, ask her for one of her liqueur cellarettes. Mine is incomplete. And tell her I shall have the honor of seeing her about 3 o'clock, and that I request permission to introduce someone to her." The valet left the room. Albert threw himself on the divan, tore off the cover of 2 or 3 of the papers, looked at the theater announcements, made a face, seeing they gave an opera and not a ballet, hunted vainly amongst the advertisements for a new tooth powder of which he had heard, and threw down, one after the other, the 3 leading papers of Paris, muttering, "These papers become more and more stupid every day." A moment after, a carriage stopped before the door, and the servant announced M. Lucien Debray, a tall young man, with light hair, clear gray eyes, and thin and compressed lips, dressed in a blue coat with beautifully carved gold buttons, a white neckcloth, and a tortoiseshell eyeglass suspended by a silken thread, and which, by an effort of the superciliary and zygomatic muscles he fixed in his eye, entered, with a half-official air, without smiling or speaking. "Good morning, Lucien." "Good morning," said Albert. "Your punctuality really alarms me." "What do I say? Punctuality, you whom I expected last. You arrive at 5 minutes to 10, when the time fixed was half past. Has the ministry resigned? No, my dear fellow, returned the young man, seating himself on the divan. Reassure yourself. We are tottering always, but we never fall, and I begin to believe that we shall pass into a state of immobility, and then the affairs of the peninsula will completely consolidate us. Ah, true. You drive Don Carlos out of Spain. No, no, my dear fellow, do not confound our plans. We take him to the other side of the French frontier and offer him hospitality at Bourges. At Bourges? Yes, he has not much to complain of. Bourges is the capital of Charles. Roman 7. Do you not know that all Paris knew it yesterday, and the day before it had already transpired on the Bourse and M. Danglars? I do not know by what means that man contrives to obtain intelligence as soon as we do made a million, and you another order, for I see you have a blue ribbon at your buttonhole. Yes, they sent me the order of Charles Roman 3, returned Debray, carelessly. Come, do not affect indifference, but confess you were pleased to have it. Oh, it is very well as a finish to the toilet. It looks very neat on a black coat buttoned up, and makes you resemble the Prince of Wales or the Duke of Reichstadt. It is for that reason you see me so early, because you have the order of Charles Roman 3 and you wish to announce the good news to me. No, because I passed the night writing letters, 25 dispatches. I returned home at daybreak and strove to sleep, but my head ached and I got up to have a ride for an hour. At the Bois de Boulogne, ennui and hunger attacked me at once, two enemies who rarely accompany each other and who are yet leagued against me, a sort of Carlo-Republican alliance. I then recollected you gave a breakfast this morning, and here I am. I am hungry, feed me. I am bored, amuse me. It is my duty as your host, returned Albert, ringing the bell, while Lucian turned over, with his gold-mounted cane, the papers that lay on the table. Germain, a glass of sherry and a biscuit. In the meantime, my dear Lucian, here are cigars, contraband, of course. Try them, and persuade the minister to sell us such instead of poisoning us with cabbage leaves. Pest, I will do nothing of the kind. The moment they come from government you would find them execrable. Besides, that does not concern the home but the financial department. Address yourself to M. Human, section of the indirect contributions, Corridor A. No 26. On my word, said Albert, you astonish me by the extent of your knowledge. Take a cigar. Really, my dear Albert, replied Lucian, lighting a manila at a rose-colored taper that burnt in a beautifully enameled stand. How happy you are to have nothing to do. You do not know your own good fortune. And what would you do, my dear diplomatist? Replied Morcerf, with a slight degree of irony in his voice, if you did nothing? What? Private secretary to a minister, plunged at once into European cabals and Parisian intrigues, having kings and, better still, queens to protect, parties to unite, elections to direct, making more use of your cabinet, with your pen and your telegraph than Napoleon did of his battlefields, with his sword and his victories, possessing 25,000 francs a year, besides your place, a horse, for which Chateaurenaud offered you 400 louis, and which you would not part with, a tailor who never disappoints you, with the opera, the jockey club, and other diversions. Can you not amuse yourself? Well, I will amuse you. How? By introducing to you a new acquaintance. A man or a woman? A man. I know so many men already. But you do not know this man. Where does he come from? The end of the world. Farther still, perhaps. The deuce! I hope he does not bring our breakfast with him. Oh, no. Our breakfast comes from my father's kitchen. Are you hungry? Humiliating as such a confession is, I am. But I dined at M. de Villefort's, and lawyers always give you very bad dinners. You would think they felt some remorse. Did you ever remark that? Ah, depreciate other persons' dinners. You ministers give such splendid ones. Yes, but we do not invite people of fashion. If we were not forced to entertain a parcel of country boobies because they think and vote with us, we should never dream of dining at home, I assure you. Well, take another glass of sherry and another biscuit. Willingly, your Spanish wine is excellent. You see, we were quite right to pacify that country. Yes, but Don Carlos, well, Don Carlos will drink Bordeaux, and in 10 years we will marry his son to the little queen. You will then obtain the golden fleece if you are still in the ministry. I think, Albert, you have adopted the system of feeding me on smoke this morning. Well, you must allow it is the best thing for the stomach. But I hear, Beauchamp in the next room, you can dispute together, and that will pass away the time. About what? About the papers. My dear friend, said Lucian with an air of sovereign contempt, do I ever read the papers? Then you will dispute the more. Beauchamp, announced the servant. Come in, said Albert, rising and advancing to meet the young man. Here is Debray, who detests you without reading you. So he says. He is quite right, returned Beauchamp, for I criticize him without knowing what he does. Good day, Commander. Ah, you know that already, said the private secretary, smiling and shaking hands with him. Pardieu? And what do they say of it in the world? In which world? We have so many worlds in the year of grace 1838, in the entire political world, of which you are one of the leaders. They say that it is quite fair, and that sowing so much red, you ought to reap a little blue. Come, that is not bad, said Lucian. Why do you not join our party, my dear Beauchamp? With your talents you would make your fortune in 3 or 4 years. I only await one thing before following your advice. That is, a minister who will hold office for 6 months. My dear Albert, one word, for I must give poor Lucian a respite. Do we breakfast or dine?